We're coming up on National Spreadsheet Day. So in honor of National Spreadsheet Day, I thought I would talk a little bit about the history of electronic spreadsheets, which I will argue is the most important software development of the 20th century. Now, before we get into my talks, I want to give you the opinion of a former colleague of mine. You can look up Professor Kowalowicz on Wikipedia yourself. He's a computer scientist, a fairly successful computer scientist. I will just point out that he has earned an Academy Award, he has earned an Emmy Award, and he has multiple patents to his name. I would say he's successful. And here is his opinion of Microsoft Excel. Excel is not a database program, and Excel is the world's most popular database program. We're going to talk about that contradiction later. Coding, programming, and Visual Basic for Applications. He's not a big fan of the Visual Basic for Applications language. He and I team taught a class using VBA once, and this was his conclusion of the value of the language. And the third bullet point says even more about what he thinks. So with that foundation of a highly accomplished computer scientist who doesn't think much of Excel, let's talk a little bit about computer history. Now, a spreadsheet is not a strictly computer concept. Spreadsheets existed long before any computers existed of any sort. It's a physical paradigm, physical format for laying out primarily financial data at the time. While many calculations could be done on these paper spreadsheets, they were done by the person and written on the spreadsheet. There was no interaction. And it was difficult to address what we'll call what-if questions. You can look over the numbers on your own, but let's suppose we had this situation. We're trying to figure out the profitability of these games. You can find the total variable cost. You could pretty easily add those numbers up. You could add up the fixed cost. You could say, well, what if we sell 5,000 games? Oh, but what if we sell 10,000 or 15,000 or 3,000? What if we sell them for 30? What if we change the price by 10%? And what if we're not really sure about the advertising cost? What if? And a paper spreadsheet, it's very difficult to address these questions because, especially pre-computers, you didn't even have calculators, but if you got a calculator and you got a pencil, you could do it. I really want to emphasize the difficulty of doing calculations in those days. If you've seen the movies, Hidden Figures or Apollo 13, great movies, great drama, great acting, but if you pay really close attention to what's going on, you will notice in Apollo 13, a lot of calculations being done with something called slide rules. Computing was in its infancy. Before Apollo 13, it's the movie Hidden Figures. Again, great movie about a lot of cool stuff, but they had full departments of human calculators. The women in this story did calculations for a living. That's how calculations was done. It was very difficult to do a lot of calculations. So any kind of what-if analysis in a business environment or a space environment was difficult. This came to a head for a particular man named Dan Bricklin when he was a MBA student at Harvard University. Harvard does a lot, did and still does, with case studies, and they ask a lot of what-if questions. I mean, go to his webpage. I'll let him tell his own story. But he kind of got fed up with recalculating on paper spreadsheets. Now, he wasn't the first person, if you dig into this, to ever think of putting a spreadsheet in a computer environment. But computing environments were very different way back when. So what he did was pretty revolutionary. He wanted to put it in essentially a personal computer. The problem is there weren't very many personal computers available. We're in the infancy of personal computing and small computing. The mainframe computing world, which we'll see a picture of in a minute, was dominating all of this. So Dan Bricklin came up with the idea of writing an electronic interactive spreadsheet. called VisiCalc. We'll see it in a minute. And it was what we would say is the world's first killer application. Why was it a killer app? Well, a killer app is software that drives hardware sales. And the term was almost invented because of Dan Bricklin's invention of VisiCalc, which, yes, you may have noticed here, is an electronic spreadsheet. The first personal computer-based electronic spreadsheet. Now, why was it so important historically? Well, there are these two guys named Steve working out of a garage in Silicon Valley trying to get a personal computer business launched. And they had this little Apple II computer. At the time, it was the only really commercially available personal computer, so Dan Bricklin wrote VisiCalc specifically to run on the Apple II computer. So what was the impact of Dan Bricklin's invention of VisiCalc? Well, you can read the numbers here. This comes out of some historic documents on Apple Computer Corporation. Look at the revenues. These are not in thousands. These are just in raw numbers. And keep in mind what happened in 1979, since this is the 42nd anniversary of the electronic spreadsheet. In fall of 79, VisiCalc came on the market. Now, if I had a company that went from, we'll call it $800,000 to $8 million of sales in 1 year, I'd be a very happy company owner. But then if I had a company that went from $8 million to $48 million, I'd be even happier. And then to almost $120 million. What drove this incredible increase in revenue and income and earnings per share? VisiCalc, the killer app. When Apple went for its initial public offering in 1980, they broke records that had not been broken since Ford in 1956. And they instantly created about 300 millionaires in 1980, more than any company in history. And that $22 per share price back then would be 39 cents today based on the 4 stock splits since that time. Huge, huge impact on the Apple Computer Corporation. But then there was a ripple. Apple, like I said, they're working out of a garage in Silicon Valley, a couple of young guys. International Business Machines was the world's dominant computing company. And they saw what was going on over there and said, well, wait a minute, we need to look into this because they hadn't done this. This was an IBM computer in the time period. This specifically is an IBM 3090. It's a mainframe computer. And the computer takes an entire room. Some of them were water-cooled. Computer operators would touch the computer. Computer programmers would communicate with the computer through coaxial cable and wouldn't even touch a computer. That was IBM's world. IBM wrote the software for applications. They wrote the software for the operating system, and they physically built the hardware. They were a one-stop shop. So they didn't know anything about personal computers. So what did they do? Well, they put a task force together to build a dedicated personal computer. Now, one of the decisions they made, because of their expertise, is that the operating system, among other things, would come from outside vendors. The processing chip came from Intel Corporation, a company you may have heard of. But specifically the operating system came from another company you may have heard of called Microsoft. A 5-year-old company at the time, privately held, run by Bill Gates. They had a personal computing called PC-DOS disk operating system. IBM bought it and called it IBM DOS or MS-DOS. What happened though, you'll notice it says IBM on this computer. This one says Tandy. Because IBM bought all the stuff from the outside market and put it together, the hardware and the software, it allowed other companies to copy it. It's very different. Apple has what we call closed architecture. Apple owns it all and controls it all. IBM went a different direction because they were desperate to get into a market that they knew nothing about. They knew this market. They didn't know the PC market. So very quickly, what they called PC clones came onto the market. And Microsoft sold its operating system to all of those PC clone companies. So here is the support for my initial claim. VisiCalc, the first small computer-based electronic spreadsheet, launched the entire personal computer industry from a hobby to a critical component for business analysis. VisiCalc was the primary cause of Apple's record-breaking IPO. Without that record-breaking IPO, the Apple we know today would not exist. The money wouldn't have been there to create the Macintosh in 1984. The money wouldn't have been there for the failed Newton that turned into eventually the iPod, the iPad, and then the iPhone. Apple's success was the primary cause of IBM's decision to enter the PC market. If IBM hadn't done that and hadn't purchased the operating system from Microsoft, the Microsoft we know today would not exist. Two huge companies, some of the largest companies in the world, might exist, but we have no idea what they would be if Dan Bricklin had not invented VisiCalc. Therefore, I claim the electronic spreadsheet, which by the way is still the world's dominant business analysis tool, is the most important software development of the 20th century. Feel free to disagree with me and put it in comments if you want. So, where are things at today? Well, my former colleague said Excel's not a database. Excel's the world's most popular database program. That's true. It is not a database. It's a horrible database. But with index, match, and VLOOKUP, people constantly, all over the world, use it as a database. It's the world's most popular database program. I've said multiple times in class that Excel is now the Swiss Army knife of analytical tools. It's not really great at anything. Good at just about everything. If you need to do dedicated statistics, there are much better statistics tools. Dedicated simulation, there's much better simulation tools. Deep number crunching, there's better number crunching tools. Database, there's far better database tools. But you can kind of do all of that at some level with Excel. Data visualization, there's better data visualization tools. Excel's remarkably popular. And what's interesting, it's led to what I'll call the spreadsheet wars. More than the article itself, which you can look up on the Wall Street Journal, you can read the headline and look at the date. This one came up about 4 years ago. Stop using Excel. Finance chiefs and Wall Street were saying we want our analysts to stop using this horribly outdated technology. Just a few days later, this came out in the Wall Street Journal. Ain't gonna happen. There's no way we're going to give up our use of Excel. It's too useful, it's too powerful. Say, well, that's 4 years ago. This fall, Wall Street Journal, finance chiefs are still trying to replace Excel with new tools. Companies would like to reduce it. Employees won't give it up. In defense of all these people saying we don't want to use spreadsheets, they've got a legitimate beef. These two research articles are over 10 years old. And for decades now, they've done research that companies are making mission-critical decisions on software programs that have mistakes. Spreadsheets are riddled with errors. You could look up either of these yourself and look at the percent. You'll see down here they're saying their estimate is between 1 and 1.8% of formulas have errors. That's not bad, but think about how many formulas are in a particular spreadsheet. Some very large, complicated spreadsheets have thousands of formula cells. If you have thousands of formula cells and even 1% have errors, that's a lot of errors. In 2008, 15 years of research have found errors are common and non-trivial. I personally saw an example where a program was looking at growth for a particular product, and they forgot to multiply the staffing numbers by the demand that they projected for the product. So the product started looking very, very profitable as demand grew, but it was wrong because staffing is usually the most important or the highest expense, and they forgot to increase the staffing. It was a simple spreadsheet error. And that spreadsheet was presented to essentially a board of directors to make a decision about launching this particular program. It happens. It's common. In fact, in Europe, at least several years ago, it was required that financial firms had their spreadsheets audited by outside auditors the same way that financial statements had to be audited by outside auditors, just because of the possibility of mission-critical spreadsheet errors. And that was one of the problems. Spreadsheets are remarkably powerful. In the words of Uncle Ben, they give users great responsibility. And a lot of users don't quite understand the responsibility that comes with their power. Part of it is that spreadsheets are, as we're seeing, over 40 years old. Here's a simple example of something that a lot of people don't even realize. If you are first introduced to spreadsheets, you're probably told that a formula has to start with an equal sign. Okay. So you would do this if you wanted to multiply those two numbers together, and you would do this if you wanted to add them together. And books say formulas must start with an equal sign. They're not correct, because I can also do this. Notice it put the equal sign in for me, but it worked. Why am I allowed to start a formula in Excel with a plus? Because that's the way Dan Bricklin did it in 1979. It's that simple. When you deal with a spreadsheet, as powerful as they are, it's a paradigm that is over 40 years old. Yet, it's remarkably popular. We got some recent information through our Career Center here at the University of Kentucky, where I teach. And for these majors, the percent of jobs requiring Excel skills explicitly, job postings, those are pretty high. And they're projecting a 6% growth in that popularity of Excel. So they're not predicting negative, they're predicting it growing more popular. And these are the ones that were explicit. You say, well, only 1 out of 4 marketing positions said it. Well, that's true, but that was explicit. A lot of companies just assume that you have Microsoft Office skills. They'll say, they might not say Excel. These specifically mentioned Excel, the Microsoft spreadsheet. So we've got this problem of an incredibly popular, incredibly heavily used analytics tool that is a very old paradigm and is an outright security risk with some of the paradigms and the way that people do things. But it's not going away. It's kind of an interesting point to be in. It's called the installed user base. It's got such a large installed user base, people just aren't willing to give it up. And people who've made a career out of being spreadsheet experts don't want to give it up. So to summarize, the most popular analytical tool in the world today is based on a 42-year-old invention. The 42-year-old invention that led to 2 of the most important current technology firms in the world, Apple and Microsoft. And it doesn't show any signs of fading. And my argument that it's the most important software development of the 20th century. Feel free to argue with me in comments on YouTube or make your own video with a different perspective.